I want to ask the question this morning and over the next 3 weeks. Can we know the will of God? Is it possible to know what God's will is for us? Not just as a church, but for us as individuals. It's a key question. It's an important question because as Christians, we want to do what God wants us to do. Not simply for the fact of being obedient for the sake of being obedient, but we want to be obedient to His will because His will is the best. His will is far superior to the path that I can choose for my life. So we want to ask the question and answer it from the Bible. Can we know the will of God for our lives? And the answer is an emphatic yes, we can know the will of God for our lives. And not only that, but Romans 12, 1-2 actually tells us how we can put ourselves in the place whereby we can understand and begin to tap into God's will for our lives. I'm reading from the NIV here, Romans 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, pleasing and perfect will. So we find there the 3 keys to understanding what God's will is for our life. And so this week we want to look at the first one. How do we begin to understand what God's will is for our life? How do we begin to tap into His will for our life? Well, we offer our bodies as living sacrifices. We offer our bodies as living sacrifices. Bear in mind that the passage we've just read was written in the 1st century. It was written by the Apostle Paul, the book of Romans, written in the 1st century. It was written to an audience that fully understood the imagery involved in sacrifice, because they were either Jews or Gentiles that would have had some familiarity with the Jewish religion, or they were involved in pagan practices themselves that involved sacrifices. So the people that read those words, first of all, had a very powerful image in their mind of sacrifice. Sacrifice involved taking an animal to an altar, and that animal was then killed on the altar. And some propitiation was made for sin or whatever involved in the religion that we're talking about, some pagan religions or something like that. But that's what it involved. It involved the taking of an animal and the animal being laid upon the altar and killed. So imagine the people when they actually read those words, offer your bodies as sacrifices. Offer your bodies as sacrifices. Fortunately, Paul inserted there, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, because that's what being a Christian is. That's the first key to understanding the will of God, offering our bodies as living sacrifices. In other words, we take ourselves, not literally, of course, but we take ourselves to the altar. We lay ourselves before the altar. We die to self. We sacrifice self. And then, from that surrender to God, we take our lives back up again, but this time to live for Him, rather than to live for ourselves. And when we make that step to live for Him, as opposed to living to self, that's when we begin to understand what God's will is for our lives. If I'm living for myself, if I'm living to please my carnal desires, I will never really truly grasp what God wants me to do. It's only when I go to the altar, lay myself there, sacrifice myself to Him, and then take my life up again to live for God, that I can begin to understand what God wants me to do. The reason that I've got two Bibles is that I want to read this from the Message translation. And in the Message, it tells us, so here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. That's how it communicates to us in the Message, which is a very contemporary and modern translation. Take your life, your ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. And when we do that, we start to begin to tap into what God wants us to do. What does God want us to do? Very often when we think of doing God's will, we think perhaps of preaching, we think perhaps of convening a service, maybe being in the worship band, or some other outward, very visual Sunday morning way of serving God. But actually it's far beyond that. Serving God is not just about preaching on a Sunday morning. It's not just about leading a service. It's not just about doing some songs on a stage on a Sunday morning in front of the church. There are so many ways that we can serve God. So many ways that when we offer our bodies as living sacrifices, He wants to take us up and use us in all sorts of ministries, all sorts of things that we can get involved with. I would say one of the greatest, bringing it back to a Sunday morning, one of the greatest ministries in church on a Sunday morning is not the preaching or the leading or the playing in the band, but one of the greatest ministries, and one that we can all do, is making people feel welcome when they come to the church service. How many times do people come to our church, and we have people here this morning who would say that that fits them. They came to the church and they came back because someone made them feel welcome. They came back because they felt it was a friendly place to be. I haven't met anyone yet who's said to me, and this is not just here, but over all the years that I've been involved in ministry, we came back because we thought your sermon was so fantastic we had to get more of it. No one's said that to me. But lots of people have said, we came back to church because someone made us feel welcome. Because someone took the time just to say hello, would you like a cup of tea? Nice to see you, be great to see you again. So now we're beginning to see that ministry, serving God, knowing His will for our life in that aspect, isn't just about being at the front. It's actually much wider than that. And we can all do those things. And we need to know God's will. We need to know God's will because every decision that we make in life, ideally, has to be tapped in to what God wants for us and not what we want. Major decisions like the people we marry or where we work or what car we buy or which house we move into, things like that, that involve massive commitments, either financially or emotionally. We need to know that that's what God wants us to do. And even on perhaps more minor decisions, we still need to know what God wants us to do so we can make the right decision. The more right decisions we make in life, the easier our life becomes. Some people just go from one crisis to another, and sometimes that is because they just make